34 felony counts, 34 convictions. Was this sentence in line with what someone else in a similar position might get?
No, and it wasn't in line with what any person convicted of a felony in New York State would get. This is a wholly atypical sentencing, and the judge noted that, Chris, because it was like the collision of a typical trial of an ordinary citizen who happens to be, by other ordinary citizens' will, returned to the White House. And therefore, he said the only lawful sentence that he could conceive of was one of unconditional discharge. But he was very clear. This was not about him thinking that the presidency is a mitigating factor. It was just that he felt his hands were tied constitutionally, and to recognize that during the presidency, it was better that this have some finality, that Donald Trump go on and be able to appeal, rather than having this hang over not only his head, but that of the citizenry of the United States.
And Andrew, prosecutors did have their say, as they do in these cases. They described Trump's lack of remorse. They said that his intimidation of witnesses, his accusations of unlawful conduct by the prosecution and the judge. I want to play a little bit of what they said.
He has characterized these proceedings as corrupt, rigged, a witch hunt, or a sham too many times to tabulate. The defendant's rhetoric has only ratcheted up since this court's rulings on his motions to dismiss. He has been unrelenting in his unsubstantiated attacks upon this court and its family, individual prosecutors and their families, the witnesses, the grand jury, the trial jury, and the justice system as a whole. Put simply, this defendant has caused enduring damage to public perception of the criminal justice system.
The public perception of the criminal justice system, that's one part of this, right? I mean, what does this say about the justice system? What does it tell people? I mean, countless hours of investigation, courtroom time, the people who served as jurors in this case. And here we are, he walks away.
So a lot of people have talked prior to Donald Trump about there being two systems of justice, and talked about that in terms of racial terms and in terms of class terms. But what we have seen with Donald Trump is sort of three systems with a very separate system with respect to Donald Trump. There's no question that today...
A system unto himself.
Exactly. And there's no question that New York, in particular, looks really good in terms of the DA's office having pursued this case in spite of enormous obstacles, and the judge as well, and the jurors. The judge today went out of his way to commend the entire court staff, which all of us who were there in the proceedings saw just how efficient it was and how fair the trial was. But I think for the big picture, I think for the sort of the country and also internationally is we do not look like the same country that we thought we were. We have a president who's going to be assuming the White House in 10 days, who is a convicted felon. When we think of ourselves as sort of a shining beacon on the hill, it is very hard to have that view when you have somebody who has not only been convicted, but continues to denigrate the legal system and the justice system that he will be the head of. So it is a real, I think, shock to the system in terms of who we are and how we see ourselves.
And the lawyer sitting next to him is somebody who's going to be a part of DOJ. We'll get to that. But Jonathan, so the president-elect says this is vindication. Politically, does this change anything at all for Donald Trump? In 10 days, he becomes president again.
One, it's not vindication. Two, no, it does not change anything politically. We just went through a presidential campaign where he spent a lot of it in the courtroom in this trial. We spent a lot of it seeing him on trial. People knew that this was one of four cases. So, no, this doesn't change the political calculus at all here in Washington. In fact, one could argue that those cases fueled the politics behind him and helped propel him into the White House. But the fact that he has not shown any remorse does not surprise me, shouldn't surprise anyone. He's singing the same old tune. The fact that he's not going to spend any time in jail, I'm sure, rankles a lot of people who would like to see him held accountable in that way. But to those people, I would say that the fact that he has been held accountable, he was found guilty on 34 counts by a jury of his peers in his hometown of New York City. And the fact now that he has been sentenced, he will enter the White House. I think Andrew pointed out, he will be a convicted felon. In stories written about him now through history will make that point. If not on first reference, definitely on second reference. And because of that, history will not judge him kindly.
We know, Christy, that he's free now to appeal this conviction. It was something Trump himself talked about. Let's listen.
They acknowledge what the judge said about no penalty, and there's no penalty. But we're going to appeal anyway, just psychologically, because frankly, it's a disgrace. But they invited the appeal, and the appeal is on the bigger issue. So we'll see how it all works out.
What court would get that appeal, and what would it look like?
Well, he's going to have to work his way through the New York State appeals system first, the first appellate division. Presumably that could work its way all the way up to the top court in New York. That's the New York Court of Appeals. And then if he doesn't get the relief he seeks there, it could find its way back to the Supreme Court, where we've already seen now there were at least 4 members of that Supreme Court, our United States Supreme Court, that didn't even want this sentencing to proceed. So that kind of gives you a sense of maybe how they would view an appeal as well. So, we'll see. He has evidentiary concerns. He's raised a number of different issues, even at the sentencing today, about certain privileges and evidence that wasn't available to him. Again, I don't think those really carry a lot of weight, but he will certainly make those arguments. And it seems like, at least at the highest court, he may have some sympathetic justices.
Well, one thing we can say, Andrew, is the Supreme Court decision was 5-4. All right. Amy Coney Barrett, who was appointed by Donald Trump, voted along with Chief Justice Roberts, siding with the 3 liberal justices. Does this show, I mean, it is a kind of rare show of independence, right? Does it tell us anything about the court going forward and maybe in other Trump-related cases?
Yeah, so first, Amy Coney Barrett, definitely keep your eye on her.
She's surprised more than once.
Exactly. And in the immunity decision that was sort of heavily criticized by me, many other people, she, on important ways, was in dissent. So it was really, in many key ways, a 5-4 decision. So that's why keep your eye on her in the future for independence, and I think sort of honesty and integrity in terms of how she appears to be handling herself in the court. The surprise here was the Chief Justice flipping and going from, because Amy Coney Barrett seemed pretty clear was going to vote along with the 3 liberal justices. So it was the Chief Justice who flipped. Hard to know exactly why. One good sign is that this is really the normal process. In many ways, what he was saying is the normal rule, if it were any of us, is you go to, like, you have a trial, you have sentencing, and then you raise your issues. And that is exactly what he said in his decision, which is this is going to follow the normal processes. It's nice to see the court coming out that way and not treating Donald Trump, at least in this one instance, differently than any other criminal defendant.
Where do you see the appeal going?
It's a really hard question to answer, Chris, because, again, it's a collision course between 2 different things. In the New York State system, generally, if a judge makes a ruling on evidence that a convicted defendant thinks is faulty, that judge gets a lot of deference on appeal. Usually, the rule is unless that error was more than harmless, the verdict stays in place. And yet, the kind of evidence that he's objecting to that was admitted at trial is evidence that he says constitutionally should not have been admitted because of the presidential immunity decision. So we've got New York law on one hand about procedure and evidence, and on the other hand, this presidential immunity decision that in places is ambiguous, if not downright messy. And the only person who really knows what it means, I will surmise, is John Roberts himself. And I think that at some point, Donald Trump is going to overplay his hand with the Chief Justice in terms of trying to interpret that decision. Last night may have been one of those instances already. We'll see in the future how elastic that decision is.